All right. So, is this acceptable? Is this going to be okay? All right. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's moving.
Picking it up?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. All right. So, I'm going to make reference back to your top 10 list, and if you can contribute anything from your top 10 list, that would be great as part of the conversation. But we're going to start off talking about political life in the American colonies, and it may break with the order of the objectives here for Chapter 3. I think the best one it reflects is the 10th objective, the ways in which colonial ideals were diverging from their English counterparts. Did anybody have any takeaway that dealt with politics and governance and power and colonial rules? Anybody have anything? Alice?
They were sort of structuring their smaller governments similar to Parliament.
Absolutely. They're making little mini parliaments. And what does that mean, to have a parliament?
Representative.
It is representative. Now, it is not a representative democracy in the way that you think about American representative democracy, where everybody has an opportunity to vote and participate. This is a restricted club that can vote. These are your wealthy male landowners. These are your people with a stake in the success of the society. And that was why they restricted people voting. That's why they said that only the elites could vote, was because they had the most to gain, but they also had the most to lose. So the belief was that they would make wise decisions that benefited them, but that it would also benefit the rest of society. Okay? Did anybody have anything else with regard to political life in the colonies, besides making these mini parliaments, houses of burgesses, general courts? Jonathan?
Slave codes?
Slave codes are definitely political because it's a law. Okay? And yes, slave codes are enacted throughout this time in mainly the southern colonies. There isn't much slavery in the northern colonies, although it is legal. Slavery is legal in all American colonies up to the American Revolution. That's a good one. What else? Anything else? Okay, that's fine. That's all right. If you want to understand why the colonies are doing what they're doing, it is because England is taking a very hands-off approach to the governance of the colonies. Again, England never gave the American colonists a handbook of how to govern yourself and how to make rules. The American colonies were making it up as they went along. The policy that the English government followed toward the American colonies was something called salutary neglect, hands-off approach to governance. Basically, the colonial legislatures were left to their own devices to elect their own members, govern their colonies, and tax the citizens as best they saw fit. So the colonial legislatures wielded a great deal of power. Also, the colonial citizens wielded a great deal of power since they could directly elect their members of these legislatures. And if these members of the legislatures did something that the citizens didn't like, the people could vote them out of office. So there was a great deal of self-rule because the English were taking a very hands-off approach. But that doesn't mean that the English didn't have some role to play in colonial governance. The Crown oftentimes would name a governor. The people did not elect a governor, the Crown would name a governor, especially if it were a royal colony. If it were a proprietary colony, like the Puritans owned Massachusetts Bay up until 1691. The Calvert family owned Maryland up until the late 1600s. The Penn family owned Pennsylvania up until the 1700s. Those were proprietary colonies, proprietors. Somebody owned it. And so the proprietor would name the governor. In these royal colonies, the crown named the governor. And lest you go thinking that being the governor of an American colony was somehow a dream job, think again. America was seen as a punishment. America was a jerkwater burg on the other side of the globe where people went to die or at least, be swept under the rug. It was not a glorious assignment to be named the governor of New York. It was not a glorious assignment to be named the governor of Virginia. So the governor coming here is appointed by the crown, tasked with overseeing colonial trade, which means that what are the laws that he's going to be particularly interested in?
Navigation Acts.
The Navigation Acts, absolutely. They're tasked with enforcing the Navigation Acts. They have final approval over colonial law, so if the colonial legislatures pass a law, the governor can veto it. Well, I wonder where the American founding fathers who wrote the Constitution got some of these wacky ideas about having a strong governor or a strong president that could veto things. By the way, just so everybody knows, today is Constitution Day. I know we're celebrating it all week over the announcements, but I'm making that particular point of bringing that up, that today is the celebration of Constitution Day. And they could dismiss the colonial assembly if they wish. So, on paper, the colonial governor, named by the king, has a great deal of sweeping power unanswerable to the colonial citizens. And the governor had the ability to name a group of advisors, counsel to the governor. They were an advisory board. What do you think we should do about this? What do you think we should do about that? They also acted as the court. What does a group of advisors to the executive sound like? Cabinet. It sounds like exactly like a cabinet. Exactly. So guys, I want you to understand that when George Washington and Ben Franklin and all those guys were getting together in 1787 in Philadelphia to write the Constitution, it wasn't like they were just making this stuff up out of whole cloth. They had experience with this. They knew what this looked like. But if you look at the Colonial Assembly and the powers of the Colonial Assembly, what do you notice among the powers here that makes this the most powerful body in colonial government? Taxes. The ability to tax, and the fact that the Colonial Assembly paid the governor's salary. And if I'm a governor here on the other side of the globe in this, hickish Rube colony, all I want to do is get paid. And so fine, if the colonists want to ignore the Navigation Acts, fine, go ahead, I just want to get paid. So there was a great deal of ignorance among the colonial governors as to what the colonists were doing. So the colonial assemblies could get away with a great deal. They could ignore the Navigation Acts, and the governor really wouldn't do anything because the colonial assemblies had the power of the purse strings, the power to tax, the power to pay the governors. There's a great deal of political tradition that is already established during this time. And by the way, here we're talking about like the early 1700s. So there are already foundations of American political ideals already laid down, and that brings me to kind of the overarching guiding question for today. And I wanted to start with this, but I'll go back to it. To what extent were the American colonists independent and unique from their European counterparts? I guess a better way of framing that question is, was America already independent prior to the American Revolution? Were they independent? And what could you look at to say, yes, the Americans are doing their own thing politically. They're doing their own thing economically, religiously, socially. Politically, what things are the Americans doing that we've already talked about that demonstrate that independence of thought, Pat?
There was no real form of government, centered government went before the colonies, and they created their own.
Okay, creating their own government, okay.
Each individual colony is
See, if you were to include that in an essay, what specific vocabulary term are you using there? See, that's the thing. Everybody talks in sweeping generalities in their essays. They don't say anything specific. So you need to hang your hat on something specific, okay? Yeah, go ahead, Day.
They had, in New England, they had like town halls and stuff, and they would govern themselves in their communities.
Town hall, local governance, absolutely. That's a uniquely American ideal and something specific you can hang your hat on, Alita.
Officials, like government officials, electing government officials,
Like who?
like the colonial assembly.
So the people in England don't elect members of parliament?
Alright, you got me.
I need something that is uniquely American. Town halls are uniquely American. Alice.
Written constitutions like the Mayflower Compact?
The Mayflower
Well,
Compact is
not
not a written constitution.
But written governing agreements.
If you want to say written constitutions like the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut,
Yeah.
there's a specific vocabulary term you can hang your hat on, absolutely. Because England isn't writing their constitution down, they still have never written their constitution down, but Americans do. What else? John, is that what you're going to do?
I was thinking about, but I realized Britain could be something too, which was,
You got to speak up, buddy.
what I was going to say was how they decide their economy, such as what crops they'll grow and how that proceeds as history goes along. Because in that time.
Too general. I don't know what you're talking about. You got to hang your hat on something specific. Got to be something specific. Town halls? Yeah. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut? Yeah. What else you got? Go ahead, Eric.
The Maryland Act of Toleration set religious freedom for the first time in the colony.
Okay, and it is a political act.
Yeah.
Okay, so as long as you phrase it as a political act to guarantee religious toleration to Christian sects, that's fine. You could also use it as an example of religious independence as well. Mayflower Compact, abide by the will of the majority. Is that a quasi-democracy? Self-government and local government, town halls, local control. The creation of representative bodies like the House of Burgesses or the General Court, specific things. Representatives answerable to the voters, self-government. They elect their members of these parliaments, these little mini parliaments, and those elected representatives are answerable to the voters directly. So this is direct. Direct representation. If I don't like the job Pat is doing, I can go to Pat and I can look him in the eye and say, you suck as a representative. I'm organizing everybody to vote you out of office. I can't do that as a colonist to the members of parliament. But I can do it to my local representative. Self-taxation and regulation. Written constitutions like the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And Something else that you see a great deal in America, the idea of rebellion against unresponsive governments. This idea of an elite government that is unanswerable to the needs of the people, that government needs to be replaced by a government that is more responsive. Does that sound familiar? When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one nation, I mean, it's in the Declaration of Independence, that idea. Thomas Jefferson didn't just make that up out of whole cloth. He didn't just pull it out of his ear one day. Americans had been living that ideal for 150 years. Go all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion. The backcountry farmers in Virginia believed that the House of Burgesses is too elite and not responding to their needs, so they overthrow it. John Coode in Maryland believes that the Calvert family of Catholics is unresponsive to the needs of the Protestant majority living in Maryland. So he launches a rebellion to overthrow the Calvert family in Maryland and is successful. The Glorious Revolution. Yes, I know James II was overthrown in England, but what does that mean for America? It means that the guy that James II placed in charge of New England was also overthrown by Americans who believed that he was un-American because he was ruling by fiat, ruling by decree, unresponsive to the needs of local government, negating contracts, taxing at will, very un-American stuff. Leisler's Rebellion in New York. Again, another guy who lived in the frontier area believing that the elite government in New York City was unresponsive to the needs of the people. So guys, you're going to see that little chestnut played out over and over again, where you've got people who believe that an elite government is unresponsive to the needs of the people because they do not know or do not understand what is going on with the people. The American Revolution is just the ultimate expression of that same ideal. The Americans living on a frontier believe that the elite government in Britain doesn't understand who they are or what they're about. So as a historian looking back with, 250 years of hindsight, the American Revolution seems natural because they'd already been doing it. The one law that really starts to become an issue, so we're talking still politically, but I'm starting to mesh into the economic. The one law that straddles the political and the economic are the Navigation Acts and the enforcement of the Navigation Acts. Now guys, work smart, not hard. Work smart, not hard. You look up here and figure out that you've already got most of this written down. This is just in case you missed it. Okay? So it's probably letting you know that it's really important. It's significant. You need to know what the Navigation Acts are. It is English mercantilist philosophy written into law. How does the English government guarantee that the American colonies economically benefit the mother country? That's what mercantilism is. And so you've got all the rules that are involved in the Navigation Acts and a series of other acts that are passed. Iron Act, Currency Act, all these different acts to try to control colonial trade. The Americans, politically, the colonial legislatures politically ignore the Navigation Acts. They don't enforce them. And because the colonial legislatures are able to control the governors look the other way. And so Britain, while it may have these laws on the books going all the way back to, Charles II, James II, nobody's enforcing it. Now, did anybody have a takeaway about American economic reality that may reflect economic independence? America doing its own thing economically, buying, selling, trading, doing its own thing. Allison.
They were largely involved in the triangular trade.
Triangular trade is a great vocabulary term to use. The question last year on the free response section, evaluate England's success at enforcing its mercantilist philosophy. You'd want to be talking about the Navigation Acts and the enforcement, or the Navigation Act, the triangular trade, and how Americans were largely ignoring the Navigation Acts. I mean, that was kind of the crux of that whole essay. Poe. Not Poe, Day. Sure.
The South was more like commercial and they sold their products to manufacturers, while the North more had like local merchant type selling.
It's interesting you bring that up. The South historically has been reliant on more international trade because they don't make anything in the South. They have to import everything. They have to import stuff from northern manufacturing centers. They've got to import stuff from Europe. The northern colonies, they can make their own furniture, they can make their own plates, they can make their own cups and silverware. But the South has to import a great deal of that. So that is a major difference, absolutely. Anything else that you came across that was a uniquely American economic experience? Yeah, Jacob.
The North is more diverse, so there's more people doing different stuff, and instead of in the South, it was just all like growing crops.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You've got that division of American industry where the North, for the variety of reasons, where the North is more diverse economically, doing many different things than their counterparts in the South, where the Southern economy is extraordinarily, dare I use the word, monolithic. They do one thing: agriculture. Now, whether that's cash crops or whether that's yeoman subsistence farming, they do agriculture. In the North, you've got timber, whaling, fishing, manufacturing, grain milling, all manner of things. It is highly variable. And so therefore, it's more attractive to people coming over to the Americans, to the American colonies. I can go to the northern colonies and maybe find something that I like, or I can go south and become a farmer. So of course you're going to get more people moving to the northern colonies than you do to the southern colonies. And that's almost a social phenomenon as well. Look, England is in the midst of an industrial revolution at this point and needs raw materials from America to fuel the manufacturing of these industrially made goods. England needs raw materials for the factory workers to do something with. They need jobs. And so America is integral to that industrial revolution. But as you said, America is involved in its own trade. And America is trading freely with whomever they want. They're trading with the French, they're trading with the Indians, they're trading with the Dutch, they're trading with the Spanish, they're trading with whomever will trade with America. America is not isolated. America is a part of this larger transatlantic trade, if you look at this map, all the goods that are flowing into and out of the Americas. Now, most people, when they think of triangular trade, they think of sugar for rum for slaves. And they think of that triangle, sugar for rum for slaves. And yes, that was a major part. That was a major part of triangular trade. And by the way, nobody makes booze better than the Americans. We are really good at that. See, this is what happens when I tone it down. Then he's falling asleep. That's okay, it's all right. I gotta punch it up a bit. But you're seeing the American colonies providing foodstuffs to the Caribbean, manufactured goods to the Caribbean. They're providing lumber to Europe. Where do you think England, the largest navy in the world, got the wood to make their ships? It wasn't England. England had already pretty much been deforested. They were getting their wood from the American colonies. They're getting their furs from the Americas. So you're seeing a great deal of trade all across the Atlantic, this transatlantic world that existed. America is not isolated from the rest of the world. They are an integral part of transatlantic trade. And yes, Jacob, you bring up the varied economy of New England. I'm just going to take the various regions of the American colonies and show you what they focused on. In New England, it's varied. Lumber, fish, shipbuilding, whaling, manufacturing, subsistence farming, etc. Much more opportunity there for a varied economy and a varied way of life. Alcohol production in New England. Smuggling. Smuggling was big business in New England. It's not up there, but I would also say slave trade was a big deal too. That's when a lot of slaves came in to the Americas and then were sold elsewhere. I think at one point the largest slave trading port in America was Providence, Rhode Island. So, just very quickly, going through this, in the north, milling. Why can you mill in the north and not in the south?
Water power.
Water power. So they don't have water in the southern colonies?
They don't have as many rivers.
What's that?
They don't have as many rivers in the mills.
They don't? The James, the Rappahannock, and the Great Pee River be damned, right?
No.
They do have rivers in the south, yes. Exactly. The north is more mountainous, rocky terrain. The water's going to flow down the hills faster, turn the water wheels, and power the mills. The south has low, flat, slow rivers. You're not powering anything with those rivers, okay? So, since water power was the power source of the time, it was only natural that New England and the Mid-Atlantic colonies would be your industrial centers and your production centers. So grain milling, timber and sawmills, okay, for lumber to be shipped all over the globe. Iron working, okay, there was plenty of iron deposits to be had that could be, manufactured, smithed, if you will, into whatever you could find. Home industry and artisanship, people manufacturing their own things, everything from manufacturing their own shoes, to their own clothes, to their own quilts, to their own barrels, to whatever you could think of, they could manufacture it. Shipbuilding. Americans become expert shipbuilders. especially in New England, where shipbuilding is really at the heart of their economy. John?
Is this because of whaling?
Whaling, fishing, yeah. A lot of their economy is dependent on what they get from the sea, so they better have good ships to do it. Fishing and whaling. Small-scale industry and textiles, and everybody was included in this economy, including women. Women would spin their own cloth. They would sit around in a circle and knit their own quilts and sell them. Some women even were quasi-doctors. Anybody come across that in your reading? What the midwife was? Okay. Midwives. If a woman was an expert at childbearing, she would give advice to other people who were giving birth to children. She would help in the delivery of other people's children in exchange for goods and services. It was almost like a female economy, like a barter economy. What's it going to cost for you to come in and oversee the birth of the child? Well, maybe like 5 chickens and a loaf of bread, and that would be the bartering that would go on. Import, export, molasses for rum for slaves. New England is a major point of entry for molasses coming in from the West Indies to be fermented into alcohol to be shipped to the rest of the world. Now in the mid-Atlantic, whether that's New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, the economy was a little bit different. Yes, it was varied, but it was a little bit more agriculture-based. Foodstuffs, however, rather than cash crops. And so, grain and foodstuffs are going to be grown in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey. New Jersey's known as the Garden State. Pennsylvania is kind of the breadbasket of the American colonies. New York, known for its produce as well. Cattle and dairy farms in the mid-Atlantic. They're supplying the food for New England, they're supplying the food for southern colonies, they're supplying foodstuffs for the Caribbean colonies. In the Chesapeake, okay, we already know about tobacco in the Chesapeake as the cash crop, but if you notice here on this map, okay, we'll put the Chesapeake right here, Virginia and Maryland. There's a division. Yes, you've got tobacco here in the tidewater, but as you go inland into harder, rockier, mountainous soil of the Piedmont, you're finding hog farming, corn farming, subsistence farming. So again, you see that division between the planter elites in the east and the poor subsistence farmers in the west. Likewise, when you get down here into the deep south, you're seeing the wealthy rice planters along the Carolina and Georgia coast and the yeoman farmers who are more inland. So you're seeing that division in the deep south as well. But it's all agriculture. Now, tobacco plantations. We know they're growing tobacco in the Chesapeake, but what does it look like, and how does that impact Americans? And in particular, how does it impact slavery? Did anybody come across any kind of takeaway for the emergence of the plantation system and its impact on the development of Southern society, or did anybody come across a takeaway about the origins and evolution of slavery? David?
I said the plantation system kind of, in the South, communities were kind of based around these large plantations where a rich landowner would kind of have power over these smaller farmers.
That is true. And here's the thing, you don't have large towns in the South like you have in the North. You don't have manufacturing centers. You don't have trading ports like you do in the North. The plantation is the community. And if you can see right here, everybody lives in and around the big house. So the person who owns the land, that's kind of the center of that little community. And the plantation itself provides everything it needs for the community to survive. You'll notice here that on this plantation, these tobacco slaves are involved in a variety of different activities. Whether it's, cleaning the tobacco, or rolling the tobacco, or drying the tobacco, or packing the tobacco, but they're involved in a variety of different things. But what else do the workers on this plantation need to be doing if they're packing the stuff in barrels, or if they're using horses to help with the cultivation of tobacco? Or if you've got, all these people here, what other jobs are going to be necessary? Alita?
There were like specialized slaves in barrel making and horseshoe making and all that stuff.
Absolutely. You had people who had specialty jobs. You had slaves on a plantation, on a tobacco plantation, who had different specialties. Some were blacksmiths. Some were coopers, barrel makers. Some were clothes and seamstresses. Some were cooks. But you had a large community of diverse workers there. They weren't all just field hands. Yeah, Alita.
To save money on buying clothes straight from England, there on a lot of shipments from England, they would sell these dolls that had dresses that were popular in England, right? So the wealthy plantation owner's wife would buy one of these dolls and take it to her seamstress, and they would just use local cloth, and they would make the dress for her, as opposed to spending all the money to get it shipped to her.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So, so life on a tobacco plantation is very familiar. You see all the workers working on the plantation. I mean, if you look here, the slave quarters and the proximity to the master's house. What does that mean for the African slave being imported here, whether they're being imported from Africa or more commonly being imported from the Caribbean? What does that mean for the slave who is working on this plantation to be in such close proximity? Eric?
They're always being watched.
They're always being watched. Very good, very good. Yeah.
It's convenient,
How so?
like they don't have to travel to get to their job, like whenever their owner needs them, they're there.
Okay, and they are very much tied to the land. They are very restricted when it comes to freedom. What else does it mean? Yeah.
Hard to escape.
Definitely hard to escape, especially with the overseers there constantly doing head counts. Patrick.
That the people on the plantation, they put a lot of trust in the slaves that they won't.
Yeah, there has to be a great deal of faith in the slaves that are there that they're not going to come in the middle of the night and start slitting people's throats. Because once that starts happening, then we got issues. It starts happening down the road. Also, if I'm an African slave, and I've got my African culture and my African language and my African heritage and my African traditions, and I'm living in such close proximity,
Cultural transfer.
there's cultural transfer from what to what? Is the master of the house learning African?
No, it's the slaves learning more English culture.
Correct. The slaves on tobacco plantations assimilated into European culture faster than other slaves because they are working side by side with the tobacco planters. They learn English and they learn Christianity. Yeah.
A lot of plantation owners would hire like a reverend or something to preach like strictly the passages in the Bible that are like, hey, a slave should be faithful to his master in case that's
Southern
what
slave owners turned to that Bible to justify exactly that. They turned to the Bible to justify slavery and what they were doing. God says it's okay.
That's why they didn't want them to learn how to read either, because they were so happy to learn about Christianity. They were so, oh,
Well, think about it. I mean, if you've been to vacation Bible school, if slaves learned how to read and could access their own Bible, what book of the Bible do you think they'd automatically be going to? Think Old Testament.
There's a lot of slaves there.
Huh?
There's a lot of slaves.
Oh yeah, but isn't there like a book of the Bible where the slaves get out?
Exodus.
Exodus, absolutely. And over time, as African Americans learn the Bible and learn Christianity, Exodus is the book that they constantly focus on. Oh yeah, I understand that. Freedom? Yeah, absolutely. The majority of farmers in the Chesapeake and in the Deep South are not planter elites. They are this. They are backcountry subsistence farmers. They are scraping by, making a living, growing just enough food for their family to survive and maybe have a little bit extra to sell at the market, but that's about it. Now, in the Deep South, the economy is based more on rice and indigo production than it is on tobacco. And if you take a look at what a typical rice plantation looks like, how does that look different than the tobacco plantation? Huh? Never mind. How does it look different? Pat?
The slaves aren't close to the main building.
The main house is nowhere to be seen. So there is no, yeah, go ahead, Dave.
It looks like Jersey or like home. It looks like women in the field doing working.
There are a lot, yeah, there are men and women in the field doing the working, and also, you mentioned wet and cold. This is the Deep South, so it's wet and hot and humid. And so what are you also experiencing here?
Disease.
Malaria, diseases, mosquitoes, absolutely. So the guy who owned this land lived nowhere near this land. As opposed to the tobacco plantation, where the tobacco planter is right there in close proximity to the slaves working a rice plantation lived far away from the owners of the land. So the type of slavery on a rice plantation is different than the type of slavery on a tobacco plantation. On a tobacco plantation, you have something called the gang system. And that's exactly what you think it sounds like. You take the gang of slaves out to the field. You directly oversee their labor. On a rice plantation, however, they function under what's called the task system. The slaves are given a list of tasks to complete by a certain date. And they are trusted to do those tasks in their own time, in their own way, so long as those tasks get done. So therefore, because they're not in close proximity and day-to-day contact with the landowners, the Africans who live on these rice plantations maintain a great deal more of their traditional African culture and language. If you go to coastal Carolina today or coastal Georgia, you will encounter the descendants of these people. They're called Gullahs. And it comes from the word Angola, which was kind of just like a nebulous term for the west coast of Africa, where a lot of these rice planter slaves came from. They imported these slaves from Africa because they were experts at rice production. They knew how to do it. And so these Gullahs that evolved along the sea isles of Georgia and the islands of the Carolina coast, they had their own mixture of English and African, their own mixture of Christianity and African. And if you listen to Gullah language, you can barely understand it. If you get an opportunity, because we don't have time to do it, but if you get an opportunity to look up the Gullah culture of the coastal Carolinas or coastal Georgia, take a look. It's very interesting stuff, because here, sociologically, here's a culture that's dying out. Because since the 1950s, they've been dying out. You know why? Since the 1950s. Well, yeah, but they were kind of insulated and isolated until the 1950s.
It's like more, like black people started getting rights and stuff, and being able to vote and stuff like that.
Yeah, and civilization did start encroaching on their land. I mean, talk to the Gullahs that lived on Hilton Head Island and see if things are the way they used to be. Television and the automobile. The impact of mass culture on all corners of American society are going to lead these little isolated pockets of culture to kind of wither away. Other economies in the South, in North Carolina, naval stores and supplies, tar, pitch, things for waterproofing boats, indigo in Georgia for dye, hogs and livestock. Of course, if you've ever been to a pig picking down in the Carolinas, that is something to behold. And you can see here the difference between the rice economy and the indigo economy. The rice economy far outstrips the indigo economy. So rice is a big moneymaker. As a matter of fact, I would argue, before the American Revolution, if you wanted to be making money in the South, you were involved, not in indigo, not in tobacco, not in cotton, but you were involved in rice. Rice was where the money was at. Some of the wealthiest guys in America were rice planters from the Carolinas. Did anybody come across the importance, in your takeaways, did anybody come across the importance of port cities and trading ports? Okay, that's all right. America is connected to the outside world, mainly through economics, through trade, through the triangular trade, ignoring the navigation acts. The importance of these trading ports in America as a place where American products go out, but also as a place for ideas to come into America from all across the globe. This is the colonial connection to the outside world. Boston, Providence, New York City, Philadelphia, Annapolis, New Bern, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia. All of those trading ports, access to the sea, were basically windows onto the world for the American colonies. And so you had a great deal of exchange going on in these trading ports. Exchange of goods, exchange of ideas. And probably one of the best signs that America was a successful economic venture is by looking at what the American colonists were able to buy. The American colonies had a very high standard of living, generally speaking, than the rest of the world. To what do you attribute that high standard of living? What makes for a high standard of living? What? Wealth. They're getting their wealth from a variety of different sources, whether it's rice and tobacco in the south, or whether it's manufacturing and trading in the north. But people are wealthier. What else do you attribute a high standard of living?
Everyone wanted to be powerful.
Powerful, like Superman, or the Hulk?
No, like,
Come up with a different word than powerful.
I mean, they all wanted to gain power, is what I'm saying.
Again, the word power means that you're in control of something. You're telling me they wanted to control things?
Well, they were coming up with all these new ideas, and they wanted to, like, have their own way of doing things.
Again, I'm going to tell you that you got to hang your hat on something specific. Okay? Things and stuff don't cut it. Alita,
They wanted to gain influence on the.
for the sake of influence? I'm trying to figure out what constitutes a high standard of living. You said trade and the accumulation of wealth. That does, yes.
They were more spread out than the rest of the world. They had
So
more,
being spread out makes you have a higher standard of living?
well, you're not so. There's more land for everyone to extract their own wealth, and
The availability of land as a source of wealth. That is definitely a higher standard of living. Yes, John.
Large number of valuable resources.
Like.
Well, the indigo, the varieties.
Okay, which I've already mentioned.
Yes, you know.
Which I've already mentioned. So let's come up with something else. Go ahead, Dave.
They all branched out, made their own goods of it, and like made their own farms and everything.
General. Yes.
Well, they're saving, slavery is a little more prevalent, and they're saving money, because once you buy like a family of slaves, you got generations of slaves.
That's a heck of an investment, right?
Yeah, so it's like they're saving money that they could have been spending on indentured servants.
Okay, alright, that's fine. At least it's something specific. Eric.
Some of them have paintings and stuff in their house because they were in the period where having paintings around your house meant that you had money and that they liked.
Sign of status, absolutely.
Yeah, stuff.
Yeah.
Assets. Paintings.
Okay.
Could it be because the original purpose of coming to America was to make money, so that mindset still stuck around, that the better stuff you had, the more money you had, you were trying to
Outpace everybody else?
Save
The idea that you could start at the bottom and work your way to the top. Based on your own efforts, you could move up. Social mobility becomes a touchstone of the American colonial experience. You could go as far as your efforts will take you. And the availability of education. The fact that more and more people were learning how to read and write and think is also going to represent a higher standard of living. Yeah.
Have you ever read Chesapeake by James Michener?
I haven't gotten to it. It's on my list of things to do
Oh my goodness.
before I die.
And you will love, it'll blow your mind, just
Blow my mind.
the scale of this novel, that's how I know all this stuff, it's like, it's so historically correct and it's ridiculous.
Okay, all right. Higher standard of living, people are also living longer too. Okay? So, Americans are able to buy things from around the globe, import furniture, imported silverware. They're able to manufacture it themselves as well, but they are going to import the finer things in life, which reflects a higher standard of living. And you see here this chart, the solid line represents exports, the dotted line represents imports. Americans are importing a ton of stuff from overseas starting around the 1740s, which to me really reflects American affluence, American wealth, American power, if you will. All right, religion in America. It varies from place to place to place. I'm looking to see here. The effect of the Great Awakening. All right, I'll get to that. I'll get to that in just a second. All right. So, look, we've already talked about this. You should already know who the Puritans are. You should already know in New England. You should already know about predestination. You should already know about who the elect are and how you determined whether someone was elect. How did you determine that? If someone was a member of the elect? Well, how do you know that?
They could justify it by saying God granted them.
That's right. Sign of God's grace. Absolutely. Okay? So the elect had God's grace. One of the things was ministers could not be politicians. So if you were the minister of the church, you could also not be the mayor of the town. They wanted that separation. But you had to be a member of the church in order to participate in the government. Under Puritan New England society, the father is the head of the household. Everybody else is subservient to the father's wishes and whims. Women were almost akin to property. The women were expected to do whatever it was that the husband or the father said. The father's sphere was the economic sphere, the political sphere, the public sphere. The woman's sphere was the household, the children, the education, and therein was expected to be that division, that social and economic and religious division. The family had to obey the father as they would God. And again, the elect, visible saints, showing evidence of God's grace. Work smart, not hard. You already have this down somewhere. Okay? You testify before the congregation to prove that you are, that you have evidence of God's grace. And so the Puritan church, over time, becomes renamed the Congregationalist church. And we already talked about the halfway covenant, the way that New England Puritans tried to get more butts in seats by having the children of the elect become church members, halfway church members, and so your seat became inherited from your family. And Jonathan Mitchell here, this quote, "The Lord hath not set up churches only that a few old Christians may keep one another warm while they live and then carry away the church into the cold grave with them when they die. No, but that they might with all care and with all the obligations and advantages to that care that may be, nurse up still successfully another generation of subjects to Christ that may stand up in his kingdom when they are gone, that so he might have a people and kingdom successfully continue to him from one generation to to another? How do we continue the Puritan church? You don't need to write that quote down. Work smart, not hard. But what you're going to start to see is, without any real guidance from the Anglican Church, you're going to start to see Americans experiment with religion in the way that they experiment with politics, in the way that they experiment with their economy. And so you have traditional denominations like the Anglican Church or the Congregationalist Church. You've got your dissenters like Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson. But then as a result of the Great Awakening, you start to see other denominations created as well. What did people come up with as a takeaway for the effect of the Great Awakening on the colonists and the reason for appearance of variety of religious sects in the colonies? And for some reason I wrote the word "and" there, and it makes no sense. Like I was going to say something and it stopped. Jacob? What about him?
He was the preacher for the Great Awakening. He was a Orthodox church and highly viewed.
He was highly what?
He was a highly original theology.
Yeah, don't use the words unless you know what they mean. Okay, if you're lifting them right out of the book or the workbook, then they serve no purpose to you. You have to frame it in your own words. Yeah.
It led to the separation of existing congregations and gave way to new ones.
How? That's very general. I don't know how, I don't know why, I don't know who separated. Yeah,
It separated them into old
it
light.
separated them into, who are we talking about here? Yeah.
Separated the old way of thinking to the new way of thinking.
What was the old way of thinking? The
way of
old
thinking
light idea.
was- The old light was like predestination and like fire and brimstone preaching and new.
You're mixing them up. Old light ministers. The traditional way of doing things. What's the traditional way of saving your soul? Yeah, I can do that in my own house. It's not the old way of doing it, though. Huh? Going to a physical building, sitting in a pew, and listening to a guy talk about how to save your soul. That is the old light ministry. So what's the new light ministry?
They go through practice of faith and not in the church. Everyone's equal.
Everybody is equal. Everybody is capable of saving their own soul. So people like Jonathan Edwards, who is this new school theologian, which is the word I think you were trying to come up with, basically God thinker, would travel around the countryside warning people in these fire and brimstone speeches that they themselves had to take ownership of their own salvation. That you did not need a building, you did not need a minister, you only needed yourself and your Bible. And you yourself were capable of your own salvation. The Great Awakening is what I like to consider a religious declaration of independence. That the individual is capable of salvation on his own, without assistance from a hierarchy. Yes, Rob, thank you. I was waiting for these. Now, you also had other religions like deism, which we'll talk more about later, but that has a huge influence on American religious thought, political thought, intellectual thought. Here's the thing, the Church of England did not have that much influence in America. And so therefore, if the Church of England didn't have a lot of influence in America, neither did the king. So the Great Awakening, that salvation was up to the individual. Traveling ministers going around the countryside like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edward, preaching about the importance of education as a means to self-salvation. If you can access your Bible, you are capable of saving your soul. Your destiny is not predetermined, but you must get right with God lest you go to HE double hockey sticks. That's the idea of the New Light ministry. You do not need a religious hierarchy to save your soul. And so there's almost a division between these New Light ministers who are out there, warning people, get right with God, the Jeremiads that we'd already talked about, which leads to evangelism, which is a uniquely American religious ideology. This started in America, it grew in America, and it spread from here to the rest of the world. It is a homegrown American religious identity. Jonathan Edwards, his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. These warnings to people. You need to at least recognize Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God as a pamphlet that goes along with the First Great Awakening and Jonathan Edwards. I mean, we could take the time and read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, but God knows we don't have the time. I know last year Mr. Gravel made folks read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Is she doing that this year? No. And now you have an extraordinary opportunity, a day wherein Christ has thrown the door of mercy wide open and stands in calling and crying with a loud voice to poor sinners. Take advantage of that day. How awful it is to be left behind at such a day. You don't want to miss the boat. Get on board. Save your soul. Now. And the fact that these American cities, like Boston, like Philadelphia, like New York, like Annapolis, they had printing presses and could print these things and spread them to an ever more educated population who could gain access to the written word is going to lead to the spread of ideas, political ideas, religious ideas, economic ideas, intellectual ideas. The New Light preachers are trained at the Ivy League schools, Harvard, Yale, Brown, Dartmouth. They didn't have a set parish. They traveled around. The Old Light ministers are your brick and mortar ministers. You have to go into church on Sunday. You have to sit in the pew. You have to listen to my sermon. And only then will you go to heaven. And religion in the South, I would say it is hit and miss in the South, because that's where the Anglican Church held the most sway, and it wasn't really a lot. Allegiance to England is strongest like in Virginia and in Western Maryland, where the Anglican Church has the most influence, but again, it's not very widespread. So because the Anglican Church doesn't have a lot of influence, the English government doesn't have a lot of influence. So Americans are politically doing things on their own, economically doing things on their own, and religiously doing things on their And just so you can see here, the spread of diversity, religious diversity in America, there is no one religion for everybody. You get to choose. And so, a cornerstone idea, freedom of religion, the freedom to choose your faith. It's a cornerstone American ideal that evolved. All right, I'm going to end right here. Could I please have your top 10 list? Make sure your name, period,